Hello. So, in this session, I want to talk about practicing the presence of God. Um, Part of my story years ago is that after finding out that God talks back, I spent 3 months talking with God with no sleep. And I kind of want to talk about some of the things that I did in that time period that allowed me to access the presence in the way that I did throughout those months. And it really dives into accessing the secret place, what's known as the secret place. So, for one, I'd say that practicing the presence of God is a very simple process. It's simple, but it takes some dedication. It's simple, it takes some time. It's a learning process. It's as simple as waiting, waiting on the manifested presence of God to arrive. I like to equate it to this. For those of you who've ever had a doctor's appointment or a dentist appointment, they have you in this room called the waiting room, where you're there for a reason. You're there with an appointment. You're there expecting a meeting. And you're waiting on your name to be called so that you can enter into this encounter. In similar fashion, you go into, let's just say, your sacred space. At the time, for me, it was my closet, where I would go into my closet. I had curtains up. It was a dark place. It was a quiet place where all I could do was engage the spirit. There was nothing to see. There was nothing to hear. No distractions. And I would just go in and I would sit down and I would get all my talking done first. I guess this kind of goes into hearing God as well, which I've already talked about, but I would get all my talking done first. If I was praying in tongues, I'd pray in tongues. If I had questions, I'd ask my questions. If I needed to vent or I needed to rant about some things or just talk about something, I'd get all of that out. So I'd spend, let's just say, the first 20 minutes talking. After that, I would spend the next several hours sitting and waiting and listening for a response. Because that really gives into the dialogue aspect of having a conversation, having a relationship with God. It's not giving God a monologue and then expecting things to go in your favor after that. While that may produce a result, that's not intimacy. I'm not interested in monologue. I actually like when God talks back to me. If there's going to be a monologue, I'd rather sit and listen to what God has to share with me. So I would just sit and listen. Because you ask a question, you wait for an answer. That's how conversations work. So I would sit and listen for hours and hours and hours. And honestly, sometimes I would get an answer before I could finish the question audibly. um, Sometimes I would wait for 2, 3 hours and then finally start feeling some goosebumps and some chills. It really depended. It varied day by day, moment by moment, session by session. But what didn't change is that I knew that I wasn't going to leave unless I was released to leave from that encounter. I was going to encounter God, and I wasn't leaving until God released me. So, though few, there were moments where I didn't hear anything audibly, but I would feel the presence of God lift, and God would kind of tell me I'm free to leave in a way. And I'm like, And those were moments, I know now, in hindsight, that those were moments where I simply received a direct download. There was no conversation. But if I were to kind of walk you through some of the stages as I'm sitting there in complete silence, just waiting, just expecting, and that's really it. Just staying still, staying quiet, and just relaxing and waiting. Because it's not about God proving his existence to me. I was beyond that point. I'd already had encounters with God. So it was really just about how hungry was I for the encounter with this God that I was getting to know. So I'm sitting there, and this overwhelming peace begins to go over me. And I enter into this stillness, this supernatural stillness that I can't conjure myself. And oftentimes I would begin to rock and I would cry uncontrollably. And this still isn't even the presence of God. The presence hasn't even gotten there yet. Uh, and I might start to yawn and cry. And then I would enter into this space where this is the presence. Finally, I'm in the presence. And it was like I was sitting in this overlap. If I was to give it a name, I'd call it Eden, just for fun. And the reason I call it that is because it's typically seen that the garden in Eden was in this place where heaven and earth met. This little pocket space. So that's what it felt like being in the presence, is that I was in this pocket space where the earth that I was on was raised up and heaven came down to meet me where I was at. And I would usually, you have a ton of questions, or at least you think you do. But when you get into that space, you kind of enter into this awe where the most important thing is the person in the presence. The presence itself being so encapsulating that there's nothing to do but just be in awe. And you find yourself surrendering to it because you found something greater than yourself that's also trustworthy. That you found something so great that you can surrender to. And I believe that's really where peace comes from. Finding something great enough to relax into. And I remember there were times different supernatural things would happen, and this was years ago. I was still a Christian at this time, so usually there was no music playing in the back, but sometimes I had gospel music playing in the back. And when I did have music playing, that was the way I would keep track of time, because I know most songs are about 3 to 4 minutes. And I would listen to the songs go by. And I remember on a few occasions that I would go in to pray, because around that time I was praying every day at 10 p.m. because I figured I'd be done with everything by 10. I remember sometimes I would go in to pray at 10, and I'd feel myself shift into this other dimension, or this other realm. And I would stay there, and I'd go through my usual thing of talking and listening and waiting, or sometimes I'd just go in and sit and listen. I didn't have anything to say. I didn't have any questions. I just wanted the encounter. And I remember there were times when I would get out before I went in. As in, I went in at 10. I'm in there for what feels like hours. I'm hearing the music play, songs go by. Sometimes I'd hear my playlist start all the way over. And at that time I had like 30 different songs. I had like 20, 30 songs in the playlist. And I'd hear it start over. And I come out and it's 9:50. Somehow I've gone backwards in time. And that became somewhat normal, where I just knew that when I'm in this space, the rules don't apply to me. When I'm in this space, reality is different. And one of the best things that I did around this time, talking about my early years, is that I set an alarm on my phone to go off every hour on the hour. So 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., every hour on the hour, I had an alarm that would go off that would remind me to pray. And I would pray every hour on the hour. Sometimes I would pray real short, just a good 12, 20 seconds, just to say I did it. Other times I would pray so long that the next alarm would go off, and I ended up praying for a few hours straight. And I remember, like when I was at home, I would go into my prayer closet. And I remember this one particular time I went in and I got on my knees to pray, and I usually don't pray on my knees, but I went in and I sat down and the curtain closed behind me and I felt myself get moved. And in that moment, I knew I was not on earth. I was not, I was in another dimension altogether. I was in another realm altogether. And that's when I can say I truly encountered the secret place, where I felt myself get pulled into this other space altogether. And in that space, there was nothing but complete safety, pure peace, pure safety. I felt untouchable. Growing up in the regular world, growing up in the natural, growing up in America, it's rare to feel completely safe. And to an extent, I kind of understood possibly what Job kind of was living in, where it says that he had that hedge of protection removed. He was living in that same, I believe, he was living in that perfect protection that I found myself in. And for the first time ever, he felt he didn't feel that. And that's what his trial was all about. Choosing to trust God when you don't feel safe. But if I was to give a name to a feeling to that secret place, it's complete safety. You feel like you're the prized possession of God. You've gotten pulled into the glory. You're locked into God's secret vault. And the atmosphere there is so different. Like you feel different spiritual energy that you wouldn't otherwise feel in just the regular old presence. Or what I jokingly call the pre-presence sometimes. But that's just talking about practicing the presence of God. It's a practice. As I said before, there were times when I would go in and I would be immediately pulled into another dimension or another realm. There were other times when I'd sit there for 2-3 hours and hadn't gotten a goosebump. But on the 4th or the 5th hour, I'd be knocked out. Knocked completely out by the presence of God. I'd crawl out after regaining consciousness, whole body trembling and shaking, and there's like power crackling. And then I'd crawl back in. But it's a practice. To know God is a practice. You have to be committed. You have to want it. It's easy, but it takes dedication. And this is something I still experience to this day. I've experienced different levels of the presence of God, the glory of God, different levels of the anointing. I talk about the difference between the three in my book. Like for about a year straight, whenever I would pray laying in my hammock, I'd look up at the ceiling and clouds would form on my ceiling. And you could even see electricity crackling through the clouds on my ceiling from time to time. I've experienced that for years. And it's a progression that as I continued to go in for deeper, as I continued to experience more, I knew that there still had to be more. So I continued to push. I continued to expect. So I consider this an encouragement that it can be done. That the presence of God is something that can be encountered. The secret place is somewhere that can be accessed. But it's accessed through trust. And that it takes dedication for God to trust you with something that precious. Well, y'all, that's it for this session. I don't want to talk too much. Link to my book is in the description. Link to the Discord server is in the description. Link to my Patreon is in the description. Y'all be blessed.